There's a moment, and I've seen it happen to the toughest men I've ever known, where a man stops pretending. Not because he's broken, not because he's lost, but because something walks into his life so quietly, so without ceremony, that his chest does this thing where it forgets to be guarded. His hands, calloused from rope and fence post and the kind of labor that doesn't ask permission, go still. His jaw, the one he's been clenching against grief and loneliness since the funeral, unclenches. He doesn't even notice it happening. That's the thing about Elia's cord, he didn't notice. He was too busy watching the woman scrubbing his kitchen floor with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb, her braids swinging, her sleeves pushed to the elbows, the afternoon light catching the sweat at her temple. And he was standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee he'd forgotten to drink, and he wasn't thinking about her as his maid. He wasn't thinking about her as anything he had a word for yet. I'm Hector Blaine. I've been keeping this ranch's logbook since Elia's father hired me 18 years ago. I've documented cattle counts, weather disasters, fence repairs, foaling seasons, droughts. I've written down the small catastrophes and the larger victories in the same flat hand, because that's what a ranch hand does when the foreman trusts him with the records. But I've never written anything like what I'm about to write. Because what happened between Elia's cord and Cecilia running waiter between October and December of that year, that wasn't a cattle count. That wasn't a fence repair. That was something a logbook was never designed to hold. I'm going to try anyway. She came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays on the Cord Ranch were always the worst day of the week. Feed deliveries ran late. The north pasture fence had a section that needed restringing every 7 days without fail, and Elias always burned his toast on Tuesdays. I don't know the science of it. The man could cook a passable stew on a Monday without incident. But Tuesday mornings, his toast came out black, and he'd stand there looking at it like it had insulted his dead mother. I was coming in from the east gate when the wagon from town pulled up the main track, and I saw her get down from it before the driver even stopped moving. Just stepped off the running board, landed clean in the dust, and reached back up for her bag like she'd been doing it her whole life. Small bag, canvas, the kind that doesn't suggest a lot of permanence. She was Apache, or partly. I couldn't place the precise lineage, and it wasn't my business to try. Somewhere in her mid-20s, I guessed. Dark braid down her back, a second-hand coat that was about one size too large for her frame, and the kind of stillness in her face that comes not from peace, but from having learned to make yourself very quiet in rooms that don't welcome you. I'd seen that stillness before. I'd seen it on men who'd spent time in places that required it. On her, it wore differently. It wore like armor that had been put on so young she'd forgotten it wasn't skin. Her name was Cecilia Running Waiter, and she'd come to clean the house and cook for Elia's cord, who had been living alone since his wife Margaret passed 14 months earlier, and had reduced the main house to something between a bunkhouse and a storage facility in the intervening time. The arrangement had been made through Mrs. Hattie Dorn in town. Hattie ran a sort of informal domestic placement service out of her dry goods store, matching households in need with women who needed work. The details of how Cecilia came to be on Hattie's list were not shared with me, and I didn't ask. What I knew, she needed the work. The ranch needed the help, simple enough on the surface of things. Nothing about what followed was simple. I walked over and introduced myself while she was still standing by the wagon. "Hector Blaine," I said, pulling my hat. "Ranch hand and whatever else needs doing. Welcome to the Cord." She looked at me with those steady dark eyes and said, "Is the employer here?" Not hello, not thank you. Just the immediate, practical question that told me everything about what she was prepared for. That this was a job, not an introduction to a community, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise until there was some reason to. "He's in the barn," I said. "I'll take you." Elias was reshoeing one of the quarter horses when we came in, bent over with the horse's foreleg between his knees, and he didn't hear us at first. He was 37 then, 6 foot and some change, with the kind of build you get from 20 years of physical labor, not aesthetic but functional, like a well-made tool. His hair needed cutting. It always needed cutting in those months. He'd let things go after Margaret. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced grief. Elias didn't do things dramatically. He let things go the way a house lets things go when no one's maintaining it. Gradually, one small neglect at a time, until you looked up one day and realized the gutters were full, and the porch step had soft rot, and the man at the center of it all had eyes that went somewhere else when he thought no one was watching. He heard us eventually and stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at me first, then at Cecilia. "Mrs. Running Waiter," he said. "Miss," she said, quick, flat, like she'd corrected it before. He absorbed that without comment. "Elias Cord, I appreciate you making the trip out." Mrs. Dorn said the position was full-time living during the week. Is that still the case? It is. And Saturdays are my own. That's agreeable. Then I'll start today. He blinked. Just slightly a small reset. I think he'd expected something different. Some kind of settling in period, maybe. Questions about the house, about expectations. Something transactional and gradual. She'd already turned and was looking at the main house across the yard with the same expression an engineer gives a problem they're sizing up. "The kitchen," she said, "is it functional?" "It functions," Elias said carefully. "I'd like to see it." He took her over. I watched them walk across the yard together, him a full head taller, her with that deliberate stride, the canvas bag over her shoulder, and I wrote in my logbook that evening. New domestic arrangement began today. Miss C. Running Waiter seems competent. I underlined competent and then sat looking at it for a while, because it didn't feel like enough and I wasn't sure why. The kitchen was, as Elias had diplomatically put it, functional. What it actually was, a monument to 14 months of a man feeding himself, the minimum required to continue operating. There were tin cans stacked in a corner that hadn't made it to the trash. The stovetop had a carbon history going back to what looked like the previous winter. The floor had the kind of ground-in grime that told the story of boots tracking in and nothing tracking it back out. The window above the sink hadn't been washed since before Margaret got sick. I knew because she'd washed them herself every spring and fall, and there'd been no spring or fall cleaning since her passing. Cecilia stood in the middle of it and made a slow circuit with her eyes. Not judgmental, calculating. "Where do you keep your cleaning supplies?" she asked. Elias' pause was long enough to be its own answer. "Barn," he said, "I think." "I'll need to go to town for supplies," she said. "Can someone drive me in the morning?" "I'll take you myself," he said. She looked at him then, a direct, measuring look, the kind that takes a man's temperature without asking permission. Something moved in her expression, not softening exactly, more like updating, like she'd expected something and gotten something slightly different and was filing it. "Thank you," she said. "And then, I'll sleep where you have me and start on the kitchen tonight." He showed her the small room off the back hallway that had been the original housekeeper's quarters. Margaret's mother had lived there briefly years before. It had a narrow bed, a window facing east, a washstand. Cecilia set her canvas bag down and stood looking at it with that same pragmatic stillness. Elias was in the doorway, filling it in a way that was clearly unconscious. He just had that kind of presence, took up that kind of space. He said, "I'll leave you to settle." "There's nothing to settle," she said. "I'll start in the kitchen." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, and I think this was the first thing he said that surprised her, "Eat first. There's bread and some cold beef on the counter." "Eat before you start." She turned to look at him. He'd already gone. I found out later from Louis, one of the other hands who sometimes came in for supper, that she ate standing at the counter, which she'd wiped down first. That she ate quickly and without sitting. And that when Elias passed by the kitchen doorway an hour later on his way to bed, she was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor by lamplight, her braid tucked over one shoulder to keep it out of the way. And the kitchen already smelled of lye soap, and something had shifted in the air of the house that had nothing to do with cleanliness. He stood there, Louis said, just for a moment in the hallway, long enough to be more than passing through. Then he went to bed. The first week established the shape of things. Cecilia rose before anyone else. I was usually up by 5 to start the morning feeding, and she was already in the kitchen when I came in the side door at 5:15, the stove lit, coffee on, moving with the methodical efficiency of someone who didn't waste motion. She didn't make conversation in the mornings. She wasn't unfriendly about it. She'd nod, put a cup in front of you, return to whatever she was doing. It took me 3 days to understand that she wasn't being cold. She was just deeply, essentially economical with herself, in ways that suggested she'd learned not to spend energy on things that hadn't yet proven they deserved it. By the end of that first week, the kitchen was unrecognizable. The main room had been rearranged in small ways that somehow made it feel less like a room someone was surviving in and more like one someone might actually live in. The windows were clean. There were meals at regular hours. Ilias ate them without comment, which was his version of appreciation. He'd come in from the barn or the pasture, wash up, sit down, eat the food she put in front of him. He said thank you every time. He didn't hover or make demands. He stayed out of her way with a consideration that I don't think he'd planned. It was something more like instinct, some awareness that she was operating on terms she'd set for herself, and that disrupting them would be a kind of trespass. She, for her part, watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, from a manageable distance, without letting the watching show. I saw her do it the first time on Thursday of that week. He came in from the north pasture with a cut across his palm from a wire snap, nothing serious, but bleeding well. He was wrapping it with his bandana, doing that one-handed thing men do when they're determined not to make anything a bigger deal than it has to be. She saw it from the kitchen, came to the doorway, said nothing, just held out her hand. He stopped. She waited. He held out the palm. She unwrapped the bandana, looked at the cut, went to the cabinet where she'd reorganized the medical supplies. I don't know when, but they were suddenly findable. Came back with iodine and gauze, and cleaned and wrapped the cut with the same focused efficiency she gave everything else. He sat very still while she did it. She tied off the gauze and said, "Keep it clean." "I know how to keep a cut clean," he said, "not sharp, just reflex." "I know you know," she said, and went back to the kitchen. He sat there for a moment with his wrapped hand in his lap. Then he looked up and caught me watching from across the room, and I made a very deliberate project of studying my coffee cup. That evening I wrote in the logbook, "The new arrangement seems to be working out. No significant issues." Which was, by my own later estimation, the single most inadequate thing I've ever written in 18 years of keeping records. The thing about Elia's cord that people from town didn't understand, because they saw a quiet, slightly gone inward rancher who'd lost his wife and maybe lost himself a little, was that the quality underneath the grief was not weakness. It was a very particular kind of stubbornness. Not mean stubbornness, not the kind that digs in out of pride or stupidity. The kind that has decided at some fundamental cellular level that it will simply continue, that it will get up and do the work. That it will not ask for help, not because help is weakness, but because asking has always felt like putting weight on someone else that you could carry yourself if you just got your shoulders under it right. He'd been carrying a lot since Margaret died. The ranch hadn't suffered, he was too stubborn for that. But he had. In small, continuous ways that added up to a man who ate standing over the sink, who hadn't laughed since October of the previous year, who kept his wife's reading glasses in his shirt pocket for reasons I never asked about and he never explained. Cecilia noticed the glasses on the fourth day. She was handing him his coffee and she looked at the pocket and then looked away. She didn't say anything. But the next morning when she made eggs, she made them the way he'd mentioned once, in passing at breakfast, that he'd eaten them scrambled with green onion when he was young and his mother made them. He hadn't made a point of it. He'd said it the way you say things to fill a silence. She'd heard it. She didn't make a thing of it, just put the plate down and went back to the stove. He looked at the eggs. He looked at the back of her head. He picked up his fork. He ate the whole plate. I noted this in my logbook with the following entry, "Boss eating properly again. Kitchen fully operational." And then I put the pen down and stared at the ceiling for a while, because I'd been keeping logs for 18 years, and I knew the difference between information and meaning, and I was starting to suspect I was watching something that needed different words than I had. It was the storm in the second week that changed the temperature of things. October storms in that part of the territory came fast and came mean, the kind that rolled in from the northwest with a pressure drop you felt in your back teeth before you saw the clouds. This one hit on a Thursday night. I was in the bunkhouse when it started, and I knew from the sound of the first wind gust that it was going to be a bad one, the kind that tested structures, that found the weaknesses in things. I found out the details the next morning from two sources. Lewis, who saw the beginning of it, and the kitchen, which told its own story. What happened? The storm hit while Elias was doing a final check of the barn, and one of the mares, a young Palomino named Cress who'd always been storm-sensitive, had worked herself into a full panic, kicking at her stall door. Cecilia had still been awake, had heard the commotion through the kitchen window over the sound of the rain, and instead of staying inside as anyone would have reasonably done, she'd pulled on her coat and come out into it. Louis saw her running across the yard through the rain, which was the kind of rain that hits horizontally and doesn't care what you're wearing. She got to the barn. Ilias was already inside with the mare, trying to calm her, but Cress was past the point where a human voice was getting through. Cecilia came in dripping and looked at the situation and then did something that Louis from the barn doorway said he'd never seen. She started humming. Low, something without a melody he could name. And she moved slowly to the mare's head, not approaching straight on, coming at an angle, and she put her hand on Cress's neck. The mare's ears went back, then forward, then she blew out through her nose. She settled. Ilias was standing back watching. His hat was on the post. His shirt was soaked. He'd been drenched before Cecilia got there. He was watching her with the mare with an expression that Louis later described as like a man who'd seen something he needed time to understand. She stood with the mare for a while, still humming until Cress's breathing evened out. Then she stepped back. She looked at Ilias. He said, "Where'd you learn that?" She said, "My grandfather kept horses." "A beat." "She'll be all right," Cecilia said. "I know," Ilias said, and then, "You're soaked through." "So are you." He looked down at himself like he was only noticing. Then he looked back at her and said, with the kind of straightness that was just who he was, "Come inside and dry out." She paused. Something moved in her face that I've tried to name in my head many times since. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though it was near that. It wasn't warmth exactly, though it was near that too. It was more like the look of someone who has been operating in a mode of pure self-sufficiency for so long that being considered, even in a small way, does something disorienting to their internal weather. "I'll lock the stall first," she said. "I'll lock the stall," he said. She went inside. He locked the stall and checked the other horses and came in 15 minutes later to find she'd made tea. Not for him specifically. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her own cup, her coat on a hook, her braid damp and coming loose, steam rising from the cup in front of her. She'd left the pot on the stove. He poured himself a cup and sat down at the table. Not across from her, at the same end. Close enough that they were both within the circle of the lamp. They sat there for a while in the sound of the rain and didn't talk much, and the two cups on the table made the kitchen look, for the first time, like a room where more than one person lived. I found her sitting on the porch steps on Friday afternoon with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing something. I almost didn't ask, but she looked up when I came by, and there was something less guarded in her face than usual. Maybe the storm had loosened something, maybe just the light, and I said, "Letter." "To my sister," she said. I didn't know she had a sister. I also, by this point, knew that I didn't know much. Cecilia Runningwaiter volunteered information the way a river shares water during drought. Not without reason, not without the right conditions. "She's still in the territory?" I asked. "She's with the agency school in Prescott," Cecilia said, which told me more than it said. The Indian boarding school system, the separation of families, the institutional reach that had fractured Apache families across the Southwest. She said it flatly without editorializing, which told me she'd stopped expecting the editorial to change anything. "She doing all right?" I asked. "She writes back," Cecilia said, "so she's surviving it." She looked back at her letter. I went on to the fence. That night I wrote in my logbook, "Miss Runningwaiter has a sister at the Prescott school. She writes to her on Fridays." And then I sat there with my pen hovering, because I wanted to write something about the way she'd said surviving it, the weight of that word, the patience behind it, the things that word carried that she wasn't going to hand me for the examination. But I didn't have the right language for that. I'm a ranch hand with a logbook, not a poet. So I closed the book and thought about it instead, which is maybe the better record anyway, the things you can't write down. By the end of that first month, the house had transformed. Not just in the material sense, though the material transformation was real enough. The floors clean, the windows catching light. The smell of the place shifted from bachelor neglect to something that had wood smoke and coffee and soap in it. But something else had changed that was harder to name and easier to feel. Ilias came inside more. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. In the months after Margaret, I'd watched him find reasons to stay in the barn, the pasture, the range. Any place that wasn't the house, which had become a kind of negative space for him. A room-shaped grief that he could only survive by not inhabiting it more than sleeping required. Now he came in. He sat at the table while she was making supper sometimes. He'd bring a piece of harness he was mending, or he'd come in for coffee at odd hours and end up staying, not talking much, just being in the same room. And she didn't make a thing of it. Didn't change her movements, didn't perform comfort or homemaking for his benefit. She was just there doing what she did, and he was just there, and the kitchen held both of them without making it a production. I wrote, "Atmosphere on the ranch improved considerably." And then in a smaller hand at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that doesn't look like my usual, he laughed today. I haven't written that word in 14 months. It had been at something she said. I'd only heard the tail end of it, something about the rooster's opinion of its own importance. And it was short, surprised-sounding, like something that escaped before he could think about whether he was ready for it. He looked almost startled by it himself. She hadn't looked at him when it happened. She just smiled at the stove, small and private, the way you smile when something turns out the way you'd quietly hoped it would. I stood in the doorway with my hat in my hand, and felt something that I can only describe as the sensation of watching a long frozen thing begin, very slowly, to thaw. And I was glad of it. I was genuinely glad of it. But I also noticed, because I've been keeping records long enough to notice things I'm not supposed to, that what I was watching wasn't just a house coming back to life. It was two people who'd both gotten very good at not needing anyone, learning, with great difficulty and no acknowledgement, that maybe that wasn't the whole story after all. On the last Friday of October, Elias drove Cecilia into town for her Saturday. I was loading the feed truck when they left, and I watched the wagon go down the track in the early morning light. He was driving. She was sitting the appropriate distance away on the bench, her canvas bag in her lap, her face forward. But just before they rounded the juniper stand at the end of the track, I saw him say something to her. I couldn't hear it. And I saw her turn to look at him, and I saw the small thing that happened in her expression, that update, that recalibration, before she turned back to the road. I don't know what he said. I wrote in the logbook, "Boss drove Miss Runningwaiter to town. Both returned by evening." And I thought about what his face had been doing for a month now, when he thought no one was watching. The way his eyes went to the kitchen doorway. The way he cleared his throat before going inside, like a man who is organizing himself for something he hasn't named. I thought about the reading glasses in his shirt pocket, and whether a man who has been keeping grief like a stone in his chest since October of last year is ready for what I thought might be happening to him. I thought about Cecilia, sitting on the porch steps writing to her sister who was surviving a boarding school, carrying everything she carried with the same steady economy of motion she brought to scrubbing floors. I thought, these are two people who have both lost things they can't get back, and neither of them is going to say a word about what's growing between them, and I'm the man keeping the logbook. I wrote one more line that night before I went to bed. It said, "Pay attention, Hector." November came in cold and stayed that way. I've done enough winters on the Cord Ranch to know its particular language, the way the cold settles into the land out here differently than it settles anywhere else, drier and more absolute, the sky going that specific shade of thin blue that means the warmth has left and taken the color with it. The cattle moved to lower ground. The north pasture fence needed an extra restringing every 5 days instead of 7. The days shortened like someone was cutting them at both ends with a knife, and by 4 in the afternoon, the light was already making its apologies and going home. It was a good season for being indoors, if you had somewhere indoors that felt like something. For the first time in over a year, the Cord Ranch main house qualified. I don't want to overstate what I was observing, because I'm a man who respects the distance between what's visible and what's true, and there was a significant portion of what was happening between Elias and Cecilia that existed entirely in the territory of things unsaid. I was a witness to the surface. The interior was their own. But the surface told a story, if you knew how to read a surface. They developed a rhythm, not deliberately, not discussed or arranged, but the kind of rhythm that assembles itself from repeated proximity and mutual accommodation. The way paths wear into grass not by planning, but by walking the same way enough times. She had the coffee on before he came in from morning checks. He'd taken to leaving whatever he was mending on the kitchen table when he finished in the evenings, which meant he was staying later. She made enough food for two now as a matter of course, and he sat and ate it, and the distance between them at the table had compressed, gradually and without comment, from the formal opposite-end arrangement to something that could only be described as near. Not intimate, not yet, but proximate in the way that only happens when two people have stopped needing to protect themselves from the fact of each other. He'd also started talking. This was the thing that I noticed, and that I believe surprised him as much as anyone, because Elia's cord in his grief had become a man of functional conversation. Yes and no, and the north fence needs restringing again. Not cold, just economical. The kind of economy that grief teaches, where you learn to spend words only on what absolutely requires them because everything else is just noise against the silence that's living in you. He started talking to Cecilia the way people sometimes talk in low light, when the ordinary rules of conservation don't apply. Small things first. A comment about the Palomino mare being fully recovered from the storm anxiety. An observation about the quality of the fall grass this year. The kind of speech that's reaching for something without having committed to what. She received it the same way she received most things, carefully without making more of it than it was, but not making less of it either. She'd respond in kind, one thing considered, often with a precision of detail that suggested she'd been paying more attention than she let on. She told him once that the way the far ridge looked in November was similar to a place she'd known in her girlhood. He asked her where. She said northeast of the Mazatzel Range. He asked if she'd gone back. And she was quiet for a moment before she said, I try not to revisit places that have changed from what I remember of them. He looked at her, she was looking at her hands. He said, that's a hard rule to keep. She said, yes. There was something between them in that silence that I felt across the kitchen, like a change in air pressure. Two people recognizing the same thing in each other without being ready to name it. I went to check on the barn. What I didn't know yet, what I learned in pieces over the first 2 weeks of November, was the shape of Cecilia Runningwaiter's actual history. She told it to no one in a single sitting. It came out in fragments, in the sideways manner of someone who has learned to be cautious about what she lets rooms hold. I picked up pieces from her, from Mrs. Hattie Dorn when I went to town for supplies, from a letter fragment I accidentally saw on the kitchen table that she didn't know I'd noticed. I assembled it the way you assemble things when you're keeping a record, carefully, without forcing the pieces into shapes they don't naturally make. She'd been raised with her mother's family, Apache on her mother's side, Irish on her father's, in a way that meant she'd belonged fully to neither world, which is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't resolve with time, only with finding the one or two people who see you as you actually are rather than what they need you to be. Her mother had died when Cecilia was 15. Her father had already been gone before that. She'd raised her younger sister as much as anyone had worked since she was old enough to make work matter, had moved across 3 territories in the preceding years in that kind of controlled, purposeful motion that keeps grief from catching up. She'd been married once, briefly, a man she'd met in Tucson who turned out to be a different man than he'd presented. She didn't describe this in detail. She said it once to Elias on a Tuesday evening when something in the conversation had moved them both there, something about the nature of choices made under pressure. And she said it the way you describe a scar when someone asks about it. Not with drama, not with self-pity, but with the flat accuracy of someone who has already done the work of understanding it. People perform, she said. When they want something, it takes time to see through the performance to what's actually there. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and if what's actually there turns out to be worse? Then you leave, she said, when you can. He nodded slowly, and if leaving cost you something. She looked at him, it always costs something. He turned his coffee cup in both hands. He said, I had the opposite problem, I think. I had exactly what was there. Margaret was exactly who she was. There was nothing underneath that wasn't good, genuinely good. His voice went somewhere careful. And I couldn't find a way to take that for granted while it was here, and I still don't know how to miss it properly now that it's gone. It was more than I'd heard him say about her in a single stretch since the funeral. Cecilia said nothing for a moment. Then, there's no properly. No, he said, I'm finding that out. She refilled his cup without being asked, and that small gesture, the automatic consideration of it, the gesture of someone who has already stopped needing to think about whether you matter, sat in the room between them like something placed very deliberately on a table. It was Lewis who first said it out loud, because Lewis was a man of approximately zero patience for the roundabout. We were restringing the north fence, the regular November enterprise, and Elias was working the wire stripper 30 yards down the line, and Lewis said to me under the sound of the wind, "He's gone on her, you know." "I know," I said. "Does she know?" "I don't know." "Does he know?" I thought about this for longer than the question probably deserved. "I think he knows something's happening," I said. "I don't think he's given it a name yet." Lewis considered this. "He's going to wait too long," he said. "Probably," I said. "Why do men always wait too long?" I had no answer for this. I've been asking it my whole life. The thing that changed the temperature of things again elevated them, but also complicated them, in the way that reality complicates things when they start to feel too easy, was the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of November, forwarded from the last address Cecilia had given her sister, redirected to the Cord Ranch. I know this because I was the one who brought the mail up from the box at the end of the track, and I recognized the school's return stamp on the envelope, and I put it on the kitchen counter for her. She read it that afternoon. I wasn't in the kitchen when she read it. But I came in later for coffee, and she was standing at the window with the letter still in her hand, and her face was doing something that I had never seen it do before. Or rather, it was doing nothing, which was different from its usual careful neutral. This was the stillness of someone holding something that hurts, and not yet having decided what to do with the hurting. I poured my coffee. I sat down. I didn't say anything because I knew enough to know when language is the wrong thing. She stood at the window for a while longer. Then she said, without turning around, "They're moving her school." "Moving it where?" I said. "East, further east." A pause. "She'll lose her mail address. It could be months before I can write to her." The weight of this, the specific, quiet violence of institutions separating families by increments, by mail route changes and address losses, and the accumulated machinery of systems that didn't account for what they destroyed, sat in the kitchen with us like a third presence. "She's okay, though," I said. "Your sister." "She's 16, Cecilia said. "She's okay and she's not okay, both things." I sat with my coffee. She stood with her letter. Elias came in 20 minutes later from the barn, read the room the way he'd learned to read rooms in 14 months of learning what rooms feel like when they're holding grief, and he didn't say anything for a moment either. He went to the stove. He poured himself coffee. He came and sat down at the table. Not across from Cecilia, at the end nearest the window where she was standing. "Is there anything that can be done?" he said. Simple, practical, not performing empathy, just asking the useful question. She turned from the window. She looked at him. There was something in her face that I can only describe as the expression of someone who has been offered practical help so rarely that it still has the quality of surprise. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe if I knew the new address before they moved her, I could." She stopped. "The administration at the school isn't easy to correspond with. They're not interested in making it easy." "I have a friend who does legal work in Phoenix," Elias said. "He's dealt with the school boards out here. He might know how to get a forwarding address through the right channels." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" He didn't seem to have a ready answer for the question. He turned his coffee cup. He said eventually, "Your sister matters to you, that's reason enough." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not," Cecilia started, then she stopped. Then she said more quietly, "Most people don't see it that way." "Most people," he said, "are often wrong about what constitutes a reason." She looked at him for a moment that went on longer than looking usually does. Then she sat down at the table. Across from him, not at the end. For the first time since she'd arrived, she sat across from him like they were having a conversation rather than sharing a space. "I would be grateful," she said, "if your friend could do that." "I'll write him tonight," Elias said. He wrote the letter that evening, which I know because I happened to go past the study and saw the lamplight under the door at an unusual hour for him. He'd been going to bed early in the months after Margaret, sleep being the one reliable way of getting through a day faster, and staying up to write letters wasn't his habit. He wrote it. He sent it with the next day's mail. He didn't mention it to Cecilia again, didn't make it a thing he was waiting to be thanked for. He just did it and went back to his regular pattern, which is the way a man acts when he's doing something because it actually matters to him, not because he wants to be seen doing it. But something had shifted. I felt it in the small things, the way you feel weather changing before the sky commits to it. She brought him supper at the desk in the study that Thursday. She'd never done that before. She'd always had supper on the table at a set time, and if you weren't there, it kept. She brought it on a tray and knocked and set it down without fuss and left, and he said thank you to her back, and she paused in the doorway just briefly before she continued down the hall. That pause. I know what I think that pause was, but I'm a man who respects the distance between what's visible and what's true. The morally difficult thing happened near the end of November. I've been leading up to it, and I've been, I'll admit, avoiding it, because it's the kind of thing that requires the right context to not be misread, and I want it read correctly. Man came out from town. Emmett Prue, a landowner from over near Clayfield, somebody's cousin-in-law, the kind of man who owns enough land to have developed opinions about his own importance. He came with a business proposal for Elias about water rights on the eastern grazing land, which was legitimate enough, and Elias met with him at the kitchen table because that's where Elias met everyone, and Cecilia brought out coffee and then returned to the back of the house, the way she understood arrangements worked. I was at the kitchen table too, at Elias' request. He liked having me present for business discussions because I knew the land records. Prue took the coffee without acknowledging who'd brought it. Then, in the middle of discussing water access easements, he said, and this is what I need to write down accurately, even though every time I think about it my jaw tightens, he said, while glancing at the back hallway where Cecilia had gone. Apache girl working out for you all right. Elias' hands on the table didn't move. Nothing moved. Miss Running Waiter is the house manager, Elias said, calm, flat. She's been invaluable. Prue smiled the way men smile when they're not really listening. They're good workers, that's for sure, he said. Good to know they can still be put to use. The silence that followed had a temperature to it. I watched Elias' face. I've known this man for 18 years. I've seen him calm under conditions that would unhinge most people. He has a quality of stillness that's not passivity, it's more like a held position, a thing coiled. He said very quietly, I'm going to ask you to rephrase that. Prue looked at him, his smile wavered. She's a member of this household, Elias said. You'll speak about her the way you'd speak about anyone who runs a house competently and with dignity, which is to say, with respect. Prue recalibrated. Men like Prue are nothing if not adaptive to power. He said smoothly, no offense intended, Cord. Just making conversation. Then let's make different conversation, Elias said, about the water rights. They finished the meeting, Prue left. I watched him go down the track from the porch. I went back inside. Cecilia was in the kitchen, and from the way she wasn't looking up when I came in, I knew she'd heard. The hallway wasn't long and the house wasn't loud. She was cutting potatoes with the particular focused attention. She gave tasks when she was processing something else entirely. I poured myself a cup of coffee I didn't need. After a moment she said, without inflection, that happens. It shouldn't, I said. No, she agreed, but it does. A beat. He's not wrong, you know, she said, and I knew she meant Elias, not Prue. That it happened. That someone said it. She put down the knife, she looked at her hands. But most men wouldn't have. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Elias came in from seeing Prue's wagon off and went to wash up at the sink. Cecilia was still in the kitchen. She said, without looking at him, you didn't have to do that. He dried his hands. He turned around, he said, yes, I did. She looked at him then. This is my house, he said. What's said in it and how is my business? What was said was wrong. He paused, that's all. She studied him with those steady dark eyes. Then she said something that I don't think she'd planned to say, something that came out because he'd cracked something open, because she was tired, because November is long and some days the armor is heavier than others. Do you know what it is to go through a whole life being useful to people who never quite see you, who use the work and discard the person? He held her gaze. He said, no, not the way you do, but I'm listening. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, I know you are. And she turned back to the potatoes, and the kitchen held both of them in the cold November light. And I took my unnecessary coffee and went back to the bunkhouse and sat on my cot, and thought about everything I wasn't writing in the logbook. Because what was growing between them was past the logbook's capacity. And I was starting to understand that some things, the real things, the ones that rearrange the furniture of a person's interior life, don't happen in events you can record. They happen in moments like this one. A man saying I'm listening, and a woman deciding, against all her accumulated reason for not deciding it, that she might actually believe him. The letter from Elia's friend in Phoenix came back at the end of November. He had the new address for the Prescott School, and the transferred location, and the contact name of an administrator who could be written to directly. He also had, it turned out, the name of a legal aid organization in Tucson that was fighting a case about the male access rights of students in the school system. Information Elia's friend had included because he'd thought it might matter. It mattered. Elias laid it all out on the kitchen table that evening and called Cecilia from the back hallway where she was doing laundry. And he explained it piece by piece, practically and clearly, the way he explained any logistical matter without drama, without making himself central to it. She stood at the table and read the contact information. She read it twice. She put it down. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked at Elias, and I've tried to find words for what her face was doing, and I keep failing. So I'll just say, it was the look of someone who has put down something very heavy that they've been carrying so long they'd forgotten it was in their hands. "Thank you," she said. "Write her tonight," he said. "I'll see it goes out with the first mail tomorrow." She wrote the letter. He sat at the other end of the table while she wrote, working on the account books, not looking at her, just present in the same space. The lamp between them. The cold outside the window, the sound of the pen on the paper. Later, when she'd sealed the envelope and he'd gone to the study, she sat alone at the table for a moment in the lamplight. I saw her from the doorway. She was looking at the sealed envelope with an expression I recognized. The face of someone who has just allowed themselves to hope for something specific, which is always more frightening than hoping in general. I went quietly back down the hall. I wrote in my logbook that night, in the smallest handwriting I own. I think she's beginning to trust him. I think that's the most significant thing that has happened on this ranch in 18 years. And then I thought about what that cost her. What trust costs a person who has been given every good reason not to extend it. I blew out my lamp and listened to the November wind come down off the ridge, and I thought, this is either going to be the best thing that's ever happened to either of them, or it's going to break something that doesn't have enough left in it to survive another breaking. And I genuinely didn't know which. What the heart keeps when it finally stops running. December announced itself the way it always does on the high range. Not with a single dramatic storm, but with a series of smaller cold fronts that arrived one after another like a negotiation, each one a little more serious than the last, until one Thursday morning you walked outside, and the ground had that particular sound under your boots, that compressed, glassy sound, and you knew winter had stopped being a threat and started being a fact. By December, I'd given up pretending I was keeping a ranch logbook. I was keeping something else. The page was the same, the pen was the same, the handwriting was mine, but what I was writing had stopped being inventory and started being testimony. The distinction mattered to me, even if it mattered to no one else. A logbook records what's there. Testimony records why it matters. What was there in the first week of December? The same house, the same man, the same woman. The same coffee on before 5. The same meals at reasonable hours, the same evenings in the shared territory of the kitchen, the same careful rhythm that had been assembling itself since October. What was different? The way the silence had changed. Early silences, the ones from October when Cecilia first arrived, had been the silences of strangers occupying the same space, neutral and provisional. November's silences had been warmer, more aware of themselves, the kind of silence that knows it's standing in for words. December's silences were different again. They had weight, they had history. They were the silences of two people who knew each other well enough to be quiet together without performing anything. Elias had stopped clearing his throat before he came in the kitchen. Cecilia had stopped watching him from a manageable distance. She watched him the way you watch things you've stopped being guarded about openly, and sometimes when he could see her doing it. He watched her too. He was not subtle about it, which for Elias was a very significant data point. Subtle was his native mode. He'd spent 14 months being subtle about grief. He'd spent his whole adult life being economical with his interior. The fact that he watched her and didn't work very hard to conceal it said more than most men's speeches. I told Louis about this. Louis said, "So when's he going to do something about it?" I said I didn't know. Louis said, "If he doesn't do something about it by Christmas, I'm going to say something to him myself." I said that would go extremely well. Louis said, "Someone has to." He wasn't wrong. The reply from Cecilia's sister arrived on a Thursday. I know this because I was the one who brought the mail in, and I recognized the handwriting on the envelope, young handwriting, still learning its own form, and I put it in Cecilia's hand personally instead of leaving it on the counter. She looked at it for a moment before she opened it, the way you look at something you've been hoping for so hard that the hope itself has become almost as frightening as the absence. She opened it. She read it. I was already leaving to give her the room, but I heard her exhale, a long, slow release of something she'd been holding. And when I glanced back, she had a hand over her mouth and she was blinking fast. Her sister was safe. The new address had worked. The letter had found her. Elias was in the barn. He came in for coffee at 11, and Cecilia told him the letter had come, and she told it quietly, matter-of-factly, in that economical way she had. But her eyes, when she said it, were doing something that her voice was trying to contain and not quite managing. He said, "Good, I'm glad." She says she's doing better. She says she has a friend now. He said, "Friends help." She said, "Yes." And then she did something I had never seen Cecilia Runningwaiter do in the 10 weeks I'd known her. She put her hand on his arm. Brief. Just a moment. Not a calculated gesture, something that came from somewhere past the checkpoint where she usually stopped herself. He went very still. She took her hand back. She looked at the letter. He stood there for a moment with the place on his arm where her hand had been seeming to mean something to the rest of him. Then he said, "And this is the moment I'll write about if anyone ever asks me what I saw that winter," he said. "Cecilia." She looked up. He said, "I want to say something and I need you to hear it without..." He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this. I was good at it once with Margaret, and that was 20 years ago, and some things I've forgotten how to do, and some things I'm not sure I should be doing yet, but..." He stopped. She waited. He said, "You matter here, not because of the work, not because the house needed running. You matter here." A pause. "I wanted to say it plainly because I think someone should have said it to you plainly a long time ago, and it appears that hasn't happened." The kitchen was very still. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression I've spent weeks trying to describe accurately, and I'll settle for this. It was the expression of a woman who has been making herself very small for a very long time so that rooms would find her acceptable, hearing someone say, "You can take up the space you actually require." She said, "Elias." He waited. She said, "I think I know what you're..." She stopped. "I'm not sure I'm..." "You don't have to be anything," he said. "Right now, I just wanted to say it." She nodded once, then she looked back at the letter. He poured his coffee. He sat down at the table. He opened the account book he'd brought in with him, and they were both at the table in the same lamplight, and nothing was resolved and everything had changed, and that was, I think, the realest way it could have happened. I'm going to tell you about the night before Christmas, because it's the thing I come back to most. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was not the kind of moment that arrives with music. What it was late, and the ranch was quiet, and Elias had been in the study doing year-end accounts, and Cecilia had been in the kitchen finishing up after supper. And I'd come in for something, some small errand I've since forgotten, and I found them both in the hallway between the study and the kitchen. They'd come from opposite directions, and ended up in the same 3 feet of corridor. They were standing there, neither of them moving, both of them in the low lamplight that came from both ends of the hall, and the expression on Elias Cord's face was one I had never seen on him, and will not see on anyone else in quite that form. It was the face of a man who has been carrying stone for long enough that he's forgotten what it feels like to put it down. And something, proximity, time, the particular gravity of this woman in this hallway, has just reminded him that he's allowed to. Cecilia was looking up at him with the kind of steadiness that was not armor, not this time. It was just her. The actual her, underneath the economy and the caution and the hard-won self-sufficiency. A woman who had gone through things I will never fully know the shape of, who had earned her guardedness the way you earn things you'd rather not have earned, looking at a man who had somehow, without intending to, gotten past the first line of it. He said, "I don't know what this is." She said, "I know." "I don't know if it's too soon," he said. "For me or for you?" she asked. He considered this with the particular Elia's cord seriousness he brought to things that mattered. "Both, maybe," he said. "Neither, I can't tell any more." She said, "I've been not trusting people for a long time." "I know," he said. "I'm not sure I know how to do it differently," she said. "Even when I want to." He said, "I'll wait," and then after a beat, "Not as an instruction, just so you know the option exists." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that I watched travel from one expression to another, from the consideration of an offer to the beginning of a decision, or maybe not yet a decision, maybe just the first willingness to consider one. Then she said, "The coffee will be cold." He blinked. "I made coffee," she said. "It'll be cold if we stand here." He looked at her. Something that might have been a smile, brief, real, surprised out of him the way that laugh had been surprised out of him in October, happened at the corner of his mouth. He said, "Well, we should go have it then." They went to the kitchen. I stood in the hallway for a moment in the lamplight. And I thought, all right, all right. Christmas itself was unremarkable in its events and remarkable in its atmosphere. There was no exchange of gifts. Neither of them were people who made ceremonies of things. But she made something I hadn't seen made in that kitchen since before Margaret got sick, a proper Christmas supper. Not performative, not for anyone's observation. Just food that took effort and care and the kind of attention that is itself a form of statement. He'd come in from feeding early, had taken the time to clean up properly. I mean properly, not just the hands and face of a working day, but the full effort. The hair cut, finally, and the good shirt that had been in the back of the wardrobe since the funeral. When he came into the kitchen, she looked at him once, briefly, and then looked back at the stove. But the looking was real. The kind of looking you do when something pleasantly surprises you and you don't want to make a show of the fact that you've noticed. They ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and Louis came in for a plate because Cecilia had made enough for half the territory and had told him to come by. And Louis sat with them for a while and was, to his credit, on his best behavior, which for Louis meant he only said one quietly meaningful thing. He looked between them at some point and said, to no one in particular, "Nice to see the house feeling like a house again," and then went back to eating his supper like he hadn't said anything significant at all. Elias looked at his plate. Cecilia looked at hers. But they were both, I noticed, trying not to smile. The difficult thing, the thing I've been putting off writing, the way you put off the parts of the story that have real consequences, happened 3 days after Christmas. A letter came for Cecilia, not from her sister this time, from the placement service in town. Mrs. Hattie Dorn, who had placed her in this position 10 weeks ago, writing to say that a family in Tucson, well-positioned, she said, a doctor's family, was looking for a full-time position with better wages and a room of her own year-round. Would Cecilia like her to put her name forward? She left the letter on the kitchen counter open. I don't know if she meant for Elias to see it or not. But he came in that afternoon and he saw it. And I know this because when I came in an hour later, he was at the counter with his hands flat on either side of it and his head down, and the posture of him was one I recognized. It was the posture of a man working something out that he doesn't have a clean answer for. He heard me come in, he straightened. He said, "Did you see the letter?" "I saw it," I said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the window. "The wages there would be better than what I pay," he said. "That's probably true," I said. "It's a good opportunity," he said. The evenness in his voice was the evenness of someone being carefully fair to a situation that they would prefer not to be fair to. "Are you going to tell her that?" I said. He looked at me. "What I want to tell her and what I should tell her aren't the same thing," he said. "No," I agreed. "They rarely are." He was quiet. I said, "What do you want to tell her?" He turned back to the window. Outside, the December light was doing its thin blue thing, making the world look clean and very cold and very clear. "I want to tell her," he said slowly, "that I would like her to stay not as the housekeeper," as he stopped. "I don't have the right word." "Try," I said. He turned around. He looked at me with the directness that was the best and most uncomfortable thing about him. "As the person I want to have coffee with in the mornings," he said. "As the person I'd like to sit with at the Christmas table next year. As," he stopped again. "She came here to do a job, Hector. I don't know if I have the right to ask for something different than what she came for." I thought about this for a long moment. I thought about everything I'd watched happen in this house over 10 weeks. I thought about two people who'd both gotten very good at surviving things and had apparently, in the proximity of each other, started, without quite knowing what to do with the fact, to do more than survive. I said, "I think the question isn't whether you have the right. I think the question is whether she knows she has the option." He looked at me. "She might choose to go to Tucson anyway," I said. "That's her right, but she should be choosing between two real things, not between one thing and a silence that she has to guess the meaning of." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When did you get wise?" "I've been keeping your family's logbook for 18 years, I said. "Eventually you start to notice things." He almost smiled. Then he looked at the letter again. Then he said, "Where is she?" "Back porch," I said. He went. I didn't follow. I know what I didn't see, and I've reconstructed it from the small evidence. The sound of voices from the back porch that I could hear in tone but not in words. His low and measured, hers quieter, more careful. The fact that it lasted a long time. The fact that when she came back through the kitchen, her face had a quality to it that I had to study for a moment before I understood what I was seeing. It was openness. Cecilia Runningwaiter's face, which had been so consistently and necessarily composed, was open. Not radiantly happy, that's not who she was, and I wouldn't have trusted it if it were. But open, the way a door is open, which means something is coming through. She went to start supper. She moved through the kitchen with the same efficiency she always had, but there was something different in the movements. Not lighter, exactly, but less braced against something that wasn't there anymore. I asked her eventually, because I'm a man who has been keeping records for 18 years, and some questions belong in the record. I said, "You going to Tucson?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Hattie can put someone else forward." I nodded. She said, "He asked me," a pause. "And he said I didn't have to have an answer. He said I could take time." Another pause. "He meant it." "He usually means what he says," I said. "I know," she said. "That's the part that's different." I let that sit. She put a pot on the stove. I went to get my logbook. What I wrote that night was not a logbook entry. It was this. What I have watched happen in this house between October and December of this year is the following. A man who had decided, without deciding it consciously, that the best part of his life was behind him. And a woman who had decided, with every conscious faculty she possessed, that needing people was a liability she could not afford. Finding each other in the ordinary daily business of coffee and supper and letters and November storms. Discovering, against the accumulated evidence of their individual histories, that what they had learned to live without might actually be something they could stop living without. Together. I am a man who keeps records. This is the most significant thing I have ever recorded. I don't know what happens next. Neither do they, and I think that's all right. I think that might be the only honest way it can go. The house feels like a house. The man is sleeping through the night again, Lewis told me. The woman wrote to her sister and said she'd found something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like a place rather than a position. I've been keeping this logbook for 18 years. I've recorded droughts and calvings and fencing repairs and the small economics of land. I have never once recorded anything that felt like it mattered the way this matters. I'm going to stop trying to find the right words for it. Some things are too alive for records. Some things you just have to let be what they are. But I'm grateful I was here to see it. HB. The last thing I'll tell you is this. On New Year's morning, the first morning of the new year, the air so cold and clear it had a sound to it. The kind of morning that feels like the world has wiped itself clean and is waiting to see what you're going to do with it. I came into the kitchen at 5:15, as I always did. The coffee was already on, as it always was. And they were both there, which was new. Not doing anything significant, she was at the stove. He was at the table with a cup, reading through the new quarter's account book. They weren't talking. They weren't performing anything. They were just there, in the kitchen, in the morning. In the shared ordinary life of a house that had, against significant odds and after significant losses on both sides, become a place where two people had chosen, without ceremony or announcement, to stop being so entirely alone. I poured my coffee. I sat at the far end of the table with my logbook. I opened it to a new page. I wrote the date. I wrote year beginning normally. And I looked up at them both, her back at the stove, him at the account book, the lamp between them, the cold morning outside the window, and I thought about everything that word normally contained. What it had cost them to get here, what they'd both put down to be in this room like this, what they were still carrying that they'd figure out as they went. I thought about her sister's letter on the kitchen table. I thought about the reading glasses in his shirt pocket, which were still there, I could see them from where I sat, but which seemed, somehow, to mean something different than they had in October. Not less, just different, like grief that has found a way to coexist with something other than itself. I closed the logbook. I thought there are things a record can hold and things it can't. And then there are the things you don't write down, because writing them down would make them smaller than they are. And this. I looked at the two of them, unremarkable in the morning light, coffee steaming, the ranch quiet around them, the new year outside the window. This is one of those.